Okay. Hi, welcome everybody. My name is Shoshana Inwood. I'm a rural sociologist at Ohio State University, and this session is all about working towards ensuring economic security of the agricultural sector. I'd like to give a special thanks to Florence Paquette from the National Farm Medicine Center for being the lead organizer for this session. And the way that we're formatting this particular session is each of the panelists today are going to speak for about 5 minutes. And then what we're really hoping to do is for the bulk of the time to really have a much more interactive section, discussion with all of the participants today. And so just to give you a quick flavor of the different folks who we have on today. We have a range of both academics, practitioners, and what we could also call really pracademics, folks who stretch both that practical side and the academic side. So joining us today is Sarah Lloyd, who's a dairy farmer and president of Columbia County, Wisconsin Farmers Union. Teresa Merez, anthropologist from the University of Vermont. Florence Paquette, a rural sociologist at the National Farm Medicine Center. Myself. And then we're very fortunate to have Annie Laurie Anderson Lazo, Lorette Picciano, and Mr. John Zippert from Rural Coalition, who will be joining us today. So we weren't sure how many of you may or may not have a lot of experience or grounding within the food and agricultural sector. And I think a lot of us are really talking more about food and ag across the country in different ways, especially with COVID-19. There's a lot of issues that happen in the food and ag sector that were really exacerbated and also brought to the surface. But the food supply chain is really long. And we're not going to be able to cover the whole entire food supply chain today. So what we wanted to do is just kind of give you a framing for the sort of topics that we're going to be talking about today. Florence, if you don't mind the animation, we're really going to be focusing on the upstream production side and how the larger national policy discussions around social security and social insurance, I should say, really play out and affect both farmers and farm workers. And while we were planning this session, what we realized for all of us is that we were really excited to talk about this because very rarely do we have farmers and farm workers, the issues that both groups face actually talked about within the same space. So many of us also do work downstream in a lot of the supply chain, and happy to comment about that if there are questions, but the bulk of our comments are really going to be focused on these two groups. So with that, wanted to really hand it over to Sarah Lloyd.
Hi, thank you, Shoshana. It's great to be part of this conversation. And I am talking to you from my dairy farm in Wisconsin. My husband and I dairy farm here with his family, and we milk 400 cows. They've been at it for over 100 years at this place. And my comments today are my own, but I will add that I do also work for the University of Wisconsin and the University of Minnesota looking at supply chains and, as Shoshana mentioned, some of that upstream or downstream work in the food system. But what I wanted to bring today in thinking about how we can create security for farmers and farm workers is just a little bit of a background on, what has been going on for farmers, what are some of the policy things that are impacting us, and as a dairy farmer, we are really struggling to keep our farm in business. And that really has to do with very volatile prices in the commodity markets and consistently low prices that do not cover our cost of production. And those are very much formed and dictated by federal policy in the way we do things here in the US. And so basically a lot of small and medium scale farmers are forced to just try to run faster and faster on the treadmill to just try to keep their head above water, as the pricing is very difficult for planning purposes and most often doesn't cover your cost of production, nor allow you any kind of reasonable return so that you can support your family and be active in community. And so I think that what we've seen in federal policy which is the dominant policy space for agricultural policy in pricing, for dairy, for corn, for any of the commodities, that we have consistently stripped away the safety nets that we provided for farmers. And so we've just kind of we've been sent out to the casino to kind of gamble and try to guess like what the market is going to do. And instead of having price floors or, payments that make up what the market is not providing, now the federal policy has moved everything into insurance. So, now instead of thinking that I might get a certain price for the milk that I sell, I have to buy an insurance on a margin and guess what the market is going to do. And so I think that's just an example of the way that federal policy has made it more difficult, especially for small and medium scale farmers that can't compete with volume in the marketplace. And so what I want to bring to that is that, increasingly, as farms have become bigger, they have started hiring more labor. I'm speaking from a Midwest dairy farm perspective, which didn't have a structure of hiring that much labor, and as opposed to like a Western vegetable agriculture where you have lots and lots of hired labor in the harvest and processing. But farmers are not really able to think about how they might pay higher wages or increase benefits to workers because they can't even cover the basic costs of production of their farms because the pricing system is not there and stable and supporting their families and their enterprises. And so I think I just want to bring that to the table, that building farm worker, and worker solidarity, I want to raise that we need to really think about what's a fair price that farmers can get paid for their products so that we can engage in these important and necessary and just conversations about how everyone can be supported in the systems and how the economy, agricultural and food system economy, can support everyone. And I want to be there for that. And as a farmers union member, I want to be there for that. And so I appreciate this opportunity to participate, and I'll pass the mic.
Thanks, Sarah. Teresa.
Hi, everyone. I'm really happy to follow up on those conversations because I'm also sharing a bit about some of the work that I've done with specifically dairy farm workers here in Vermont, where I'm currently looking at quite a few inches of snow out the window. So one of the things that I wanted to share is just a few findings from the research that I've done for about the last 10 years or so here in Vermont. And as an anthropologist, I sort of tend towards the more qualitative side of research, but in the project that I'll be sharing a bit about, I also use some quantitative tools which are connected to the USDA Household Food Security Survey module. So Florence, if you want to actually put up the next box as well. So one of the things to know, actually, no, if you could go back. Thank you. So Vermont, we often kind of say in the state that our largest dairy farms are some of Wisconsin's smaller dairy farms, that it's a pretty small state in general when we look at dairy, the size of dairy farms. And, these questions of price volatility and, producing and milk at far below what you're actually getting for it, or getting not enough money for it, is something that is certainly really important for us to consider. One of the things that I've looked at is the question of farm worker food security, which of course, as we look across the food chain, we know that food and farm workers, whether it's dairy farm owners, dairy farm workers, restaurant workers, are more likely to go hungry than the general population. And that is one of those things, part of the food system that is, I think, a really revealing point about how frail and damaged it really is. So I've spent the last number of years looking at the experiences of farm workers in the state of Vermont in the dairy industry accessing food, and particularly how their access to food is compromised by the fact that we're a border state. And for undocumented workers in this industry, living and working very close to the US-Canada border can often put them at risk for being detained. And so there are similar things to be said about access to healthcare, access to, going to church, access to anything that happens in the public. But my particular area of interest has been looking at food security. So one of the things that we know is that when you look at seasonal agricultural production, there's been a number of research projects that have looked at, crop workers. Oftentimes, farm workers are experiencing food insecurity at 3 to 4 times the national average. Pre-pandemic, that average was right around 14%, and those numbers are all over the place right now because of how volatile really food access is currently under the pandemic. And really, there was no research done in this community with respect to food access before some of the work that I did. So what I found through administering the USDA Household Food Security Survey with a number of farm worker households is that farm workers in the state were actually not being categorized as having really elevated rates of food insecurity, largely because how we measure it is really flawed. That module that the USDA utilizes, not just with farm worker communities, but with everyone, kind of doesn't pay attention to the realities that often transnational families face, those people who might be maintaining family networks and households in Mexico, and those that they are also maintaining here. And so there's sometimes really a problem of measurement when we look at food security within immigrant communities, and it's something that hopefully I help redesign some survey tools that are a little bit more helpful. Florence, if you want to go to the next slide. One of the other things that I've spent a bit of time thinking about is, how this is a gendered experience, how women are often, at the forefront of ensuring food access for their home. And looking at some of the data, we don't really see necessarily the same kind of gendered roles in farm worker families as we do in the general population, in terms of especially crop work, where women might have actually equal opportunity to earn the same amount of money, often limited money, as their male counterparts. But this just shows a little bit about some of the findings where in Vermont, only about 18% of households were classified as food insecure. And again, this is part of, I think the failure of the instrument to really adequately reflect the challenges that immigrant families in the state have accessing food. So one thing that I just wanted to link to really quickly, and this is the last point that I'll make, is that when we look at a sector like dairy, where dairy farm owners, Florence, you can go on to the final one, where dairy farm owners are facing, not getting enough money and rising feed prices and, challenging land values, all of these things, is that there are some really interesting programs that have been explored here in Vermont based upon the Coalition Immokalee worker model to expand that to dairy. And I'm happy to talk about that more in the discussion. But this program, specifically the Milk with Dignity Agreement, hopefully offers a bit more actual financial incentive to dairy farm owners to offer more just workplaces for their employees. So I'm happy to talk about that in a little bit more detail when we get to the discussion.
Thanks so much, Teresa. Lots of great questions, I'm sure, in conversation that are going to be stimulated just from Sarah and Teresa's quick overviews. Florence.
Thanks, Trisha. Good afternoon, everyone. So today I will be making my remarks around 2 main points. The first one is connected to the lived realities of farm families with access to health insurance. And the second one is connected to broader discussions around farm household social and economic needs, social policy, and farm resilience. And I will note that this is work that I've been doing with Shoshana for the past, I think we're up to 5-6 years working on this. So in terms of the lived realities of farm families with health insurance, and there are some similarities with farm workers, but our study really has focused on what we'll call farmer operators. What I will say, though, in terms of health is that globally, farming is one of the most dangerous occupations, both in terms of physical and mental health outcomes. And as a physical occupation, we know that health difficulties not only impact individuals' well-being, but also impact productivity on the farm and may lead to early farm exits. So in a 2008 study of commercial farmers, what was interesting is the survey instrument looked at the major threats that farmers were facing. And the top threat that came up was the cost of health insurance, ranked as the highest threat to livelihood for 65% of respondents. And what was interesting is that this was higher than threats connected to the farm business, such as the cost of inputs and the cost of farmland. So in 2017, Shoshana and I, with other colleagues, conducted a survey of farm families in 10 US states. And the goal of that study was really about understanding how health insurance impacts family health, quality of life, farm development, and economic development through food and agriculture. And so in terms of the key findings, and I will only give a very general overview of how the farm families are similar and different from the general population. So in our study of about 1,200 respondents, 92% of these households said that they had health insurance coverage, which is higher than the general population. But we also know that there were challenges connected to underinsurance that we'll touch on in a minute. As far as the source of coverage goes, off-farm employment was the most important source of coverage, followed by public insurance, which was connected to the fact that we had a sample of a farm population with an average age of about 59 years old. And the third more important source of was direct purchase of private policy. What I will say about off-farm employment is that we've long known that it's an important source of both health insurance and household income, in particular when the farm business is not bringing in enough money. And that brings up a couple of main challenges. On one hand, off-farm employment takes time away from the farm business, and from the quality of work, we know that that time at the off-farm employment directly impacts what people can do in the farm, the structure of the farm, and opportunities for growth. There's also broader connections connected to jobs in rural areas, which are less likely to offer benefits such as health insurance. So overall, what our results raise questions around the adequacy of coverage and issues of underinsurance. We had half of the households responding that they were not confident that they could pay for the cost of major illness or injuries without going into debt. And what was interesting is when we looked, when we did regression analysis, when we were trying to understand which factors are associated with people being concerned about their ability to pay, most of what was statistically significant was connected to health status and to health insurance arrangements. And so what's interesting was that for us with this study, it appears that health insurance is really an issue that impacts not certain type of farmers, but really the heterogeneous farm population. And the last thing that I will say about the health insurance study that's connected to this conference on policy is that when respondents were asked if they would like the USDA to be involved in the conversation, 72% said that they would like the USDA to represent them in national insurance policy discussions. So the second note that I want to make is on the connection between farm household social and economic needs, social policy, and farm resilience. So we know that historically, I should say, most of the policies that are supporting the farm sector are through agricultural policies through the Farm Bill. And I won't get into the details of the Farm Bill. It's a very complex piece of policy voted on about every 5 years. But I think there are 3 key points to remember in the context of today's discussion. There are wide variations in the type of farm operations that benefit from these programs. Arguably, many folks would say that farmers who need most support are left out of many of these programs, and there are larger connections to histories of discrimination. And the last piece is that these programs are really not designed with the well-being of the farm household in mind. And when we think about farm resilience and the ability of farms to stay on the land, we know that farm households play an essential role due to the interconnections between the farm household and the farm operation, whereas the farm household, for example, folks who work on the farm without pay or reduce household consumption when times are harder. And so what's interesting is that we do know that farm families are experiencing difficulties meeting household level needs, which brings up Keith's question around the extent to which, if we had a stronger social safety net in the US, it brings up question about not only the extent to which it would support household well-being, but also the role that it could play in shoring up the farm business in an agriculture environment that will not only to continue to be more competitive, but also more uncertain with climate change.
Thanks, Florence. And I'm going to continue on for where Florence left off and talk a little bit about how childcare affects the food and agricultural sector. And I think it's really interesting when we look at all the different sessions that are actually offered throughout this conference. A number of them are focused on childcare. And this is an issue that was not really in the mainstream just a year ago, but I think COVID has created this collective gestalt in the country now that everybody's been doing some form of caretaking, whether it's for young children or older parents. We're now having a much greater appreciation for the time and importance of caretaking work. And this is an issue that has been grossly, I would argue, under-discussed in the farms and agricultural sector. I think it's actually folks who work on farm workers have done a lot more work on this than folks who actually study and focus on the farmer and the farm family. And one of the reasons I think that it's really important to talk about these social issues is that as a nation, right, we need to eat. And farmers are the way that we eat, and farmers and farm workers. And right now, less than 2% of our population is farming, and the average age is 58.9. So I think what we really have to be thinking about is with all of these issues as they go across all the different sessions that are happening, is how do these social issues affect our food and agricultural sector and really our own selfishly individual ability to eat. So over the last 10 years, we've really been looking at this issue of childcare both qualitatively and quantitatively across the country. And it was really coming out of observations of some of my friends who were farming, who had put a lot of time and energy into being apprentices, gaining the capital to start their own farms. And then once their kids came along, it introduced this whole new level of stress and pressure. And so in some cases, some were leaving agriculture, and others were actually leading to divorce and complete disillusionment of their farm and their family. And one of the things I think is really interesting when we talk about agricultural policy is that it tends to really focus on the production end and the financial components of it, right? And so we could kind of say that this has really been a neoliberal approach to agricultural policy. And when we look at the Farm Bill and a lot of the other types of supports, there's not a real accounting for the fact that farmers are working parents, and also that there are household issues that are going to be affecting the production system, the types of choices both in marketing and production that are being made. So I just wanted to very quickly give you some high-level highlights of what we've been finding. That childcare is really an issue for everybody, big surprise, no matter what type of farmer you are or farm worker. But what we see is that it's actually a bigger problem for women farmers and for first generation farmers. So those without any connection previously to agriculture. And so when we look at how much money is being invested by USDA and the Beginning Farmer and Rancher program, what we see again is that there's a lot of emphasis on trying to create internships and access to land and skill development, but there's not been any investment in this issue of childcare. And the way that we really see that this affects the farm is through a couple of different ways. One is through farmers, even like their social identities and relationships. And this is especially an issue for women because as generally the primary caretaker, as they go from farmer to mother, their role in the farm sometimes changes as they go from maybe being out in the fields to being the bookkeeper. And what does that relationship look like with staff? It's also, we've seen how it actually does affect the physical development of the farm. It affects when people decide to go for markets because that can be connected to the school year calendar. It's about how close is the field to the house, so that if there's a kid who needs to be watched, right? And also that these issues change as children get older, right? Your needs when kids are infants is going to be really different when they're teenagers. And it's also just really affects how farmers actually think about the way that they plan the farm and their time frame. So where I see this is also going is that it's also tied to larger rural development issues, right? And we know from lots of different work, and we know just from the number of panels here today, how important childcare is as a form of social insurance for economic and social well-being. But oftentimes, a lot of those conversations tend to focus and have an urban bias. And I think there's a real opportunity for thinking about how do the solutions play out for rural communities, but then also in industries like agriculture, where you have a family business and you're not in a 9-to-5 type of job. So how do we make alliances also with like factory workers who have a second or third shift who are going 7 days a week, like that's parallel to farming? How do we look at other countries that have more paid maternity leave and paternity leave? And what does that mean for if you're self-employed as opposed to being an employer-based occupation? So I'm really excited to actually make some new coalitions and looking to connect with people that have thought about what childcare policy could look like and how do we dovetail that with the specific needs for the farm community. And so with that, I'd love to turn it over to our colleagues at Rural Coalition. So Annie Laurie, would you like to go going first?
Sure. My name is Annie Laurie, and I am the research director with Rural Coalition. We're a 41-year-old organization comprised of over 50 member organizations that are farmer and farm worker led. Today, I believe if Mr. Zippert is with us, and he is the chair of our Rural Coalition. And are you there, Mr. Zippert? And are you ready to talk about land tenure and?
Yes. So can you hear me?
Yes, perfectly.
Okay, great. So I think I've heard here on the panel issues that affect farmers in general in this country, issues of price, issues of the social safety net, issues of the regulations and programs of U.S. Department of Agriculture often being relevant more to the larger or corporate agriculture than they are to the small family farm. All of those problems exist for us. And then we have the additional lens that for Black, Indigenous, Hispanic, Pacific, Asian Pacific Islander farmers, we have the additional lens and problems of discrimination and neglect and the failure really of USDA to recognize the importance of helping and keeping all the different groups of people in this country on the land. And the high point of Black land ownership in this country was 1920. There were over 1 million Black people engaged in agriculture who owned 15 million acres of land in 1920, a century ago. By 1960, this had dropped to 60,000 farmers owning about 6 million acres. And you know, since 1960 has been the whole civil rights movement and all of the benefits and changes that came as a result of that. And yet in the last census of agriculture, the number of Black farmers had declined to about 30,000 and ownership of about 3 million acres. So there's a steady decline, a steady shifting of people out of agriculture. One of the other problems that this raises is that it's related to the whole disparity in this country between white and Black wealth. And that if you look at this, the land ownership that Black people had in this country was a strong basis for wealth, and yet that land has dissipated over the last century. In addition, today we have a problem that probably half of the Black-owned land in this country is owned as heir property. That is to say that people have an undivided interest in the land, not a clear title. So grandpa died in 1950 and had 6 children. Each of those people had a group of children, all because grandpa didn't leave a will. All of those people own an undivided interest in the land. This has created problems in getting resources from the government, credit, conservation, marketing, other assistance, because up until the 2018 Farm Bill, they insisted that every single one of the heirs had to sign, which in some cases was a very difficult proposition. Now the Rural Coalition was able to get some changes in the 2018 Farm Bill that made it possible to recognize ways in which they could look differently at this problem and also look at states that have adopted the Uniform Heirs Property Act. So what I'm really saying here is that the Rural Coalition has been engaged with the U.S. Department of Agriculture to get them to pay more attention to the needs of Black and other people of color farmers, to the needs of farm workers, to the needs of low-income rural people, some of whom are engaged in agriculture, and others, people living in rural communities, and that this has been a long battle. And we have won some things on the margins of this to improve the conditions of the people we represent, but we have a long, hard road to go. And we need to get from the very top levels of USDA a better recognition of these problems and a willingness to do something about it. So I'll stop there and participate in the question and answer part.
Thank you so much, Mr. Zippert and Annie Laurie. I'm going to turn it over to Florence, who's going to help facilitate us through this last section where we can hopefully have a more lively, engaged discussion.
Thanks, Shoshana, and thank you, Mr. Zippert, for your insights. So for the last about 20 minutes that we have together, what we do is we have a series of questions to talk about as a panel, but also if folks from the audience want to participate. And I think we can do this in a few different ways. People can speak up, but also can feel free to share through the chat box. So the first question that we have is connected to what initiatives or policy ideas hold the most promise to improve economic security in the agricultural sector. And I'll open it to everyone.
Well, I'll jump in. This is Sarah, and back to my assertion that we really need to think about what farmers are paid, so that then the ways that their economic engines of farms can support workers and their own families and their communities is really important. So I didn't mention it in my main time, but there is a group of people working on a project called Disparity to Parity, which is really looking at reintroducing this understanding of parity pricing. And that means kind of tying agricultural prices to like the consumer price index. So there's fairness in what farmers are getting paid and what consumers are experiencing, because as a farmer, like I also need workers in general to get paid decent wages so that they can afford to buy my products at a good price. So I need that to be linked together. And so, I encourage people, Disparity to parity.org is a website with a lot of educational information about this drive to try to, in the policy sector, like think about both consumers' experiences in the markets, but what farmers are getting paid, and to create fairness across the economy.
Sure. I was trying to give a little a moment for others to indicate from participants in the audience. But I did want to just mention that I especially appreciated everyone kind of grounding their remarks in some observations about how that shifts during the time of COVID and what the lens of the pandemic has done for these issues. Of course, for the Rural Coalition, we're really looking at what's coming out in the pandemic relief packages. Of course, we released a letter that was actually invited by the Senate Ag Committee for us to get organizations to sign on to a letter about addressing some of the longstanding issues for BIPOC farmers that Mr. Zippert talked about. And one of the things that I just wanted to accentuate in that is these heirs property issues are also, not only are they a barrier to transferring the farmland and shoring up the health of the farm, but also barriers to access to credit and to insurance. And one of the things that we are working on right now is a study with AFRI to create a survey instrument to look at small and medium scale farmers and how they have access to insurance and to various other supports for farmers during this time. So yes.
I was just gonna say, can you clarify, when you say insurance, are you talking health insurance or crop insurance? Because I think those
yes.
It's always helpful to distinguish.
Any kinds of insurance. It's interesting. Rural Coalition did a survey in 2008 and found that many of the, especially people of color farmers in the South, had life insurance. So they understand the concept of insurance, but they didn't have access to things like flood insurance. So, also not having access to a farm number means you're not visible for FEMA. So all of these different kinds of, and because we're really thinking about what kind of safety net do we need to shore up these communities, I wanted to just mention the insurance piece. And of course also many of the farmers are on the floodplain. So do they have access to flood insurance? We've also initially found that in some cases, farmers are sold various kinds of insurance, including flood insurance, but may not be able to make claims on that insurance because they're in the floodplain. But so these various overlapping historic discriminatory practices are very interrelated. And so, and then of course, also access to health insurance. So I'm, Mr. Zippert, of course, has been really a champion of working on expanding Medicaid in Alabama and throughout the Southeast. But I'd also really invite folks to see some of the other work that our coalition is advancing forward, because we also have a number of member organizations that represent and that are farm workers, especially Alianza Nacional de Campesinas. And there are a number of spaces where we really need to vigil some of the the bills that are going through on immigration reform, and excluding, attempting again and again to put in language that excludes farm workers. So I am really mindful of of taking too much of the time to talk about those things, but I invite all of us here to continue talking about and being informed about what's actually urgent right now.
Thanks, Annie Laurie. Any other thoughts on this question? We have a couple more questions and we have about 10 minutes left. So that to give you an idea of where we're at.
Well, I would just add, I think that it might be interesting and helpful to also start reframing how do we think about food and agriculture, not just in the production sphere, but really like the people, right, as part of the public good. And what does it mean to have jobs that are for part of the public good in the same way that we value, you know, teachers or police officers or firefighters, right? And the benefits that are afforded them. And how do we maybe even think about re-envisioning, you know, that and changing our values, right, away from just being a productionist kind of component.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Shoshana, and just really bringing it back to like what should be the principles guiding public investment and this notion of the public safety net. I mean, again, you know, one of the things that that we're working on related to land loss is this investment of pension fund monies into farmland, into buying up farmland. And there are a number of, you know, teachers and professors who, especially with TIA, who are absolutely unaware that this is how their retirement money is being invested. And you know, just looking at also with, you know, as we start to think about how do we address like the big looming you know, threat to our existence, how do we mitigate against, you know, climate change? There's also a great opportunity in looking at how farmers provide ecological services, but there's also there's a grave danger that that we will be incentivizing things like carbon markets, which monetize and privatize, you know, these things like who owns carbon. And you know, should it be serving the public good?
Does anybody else on the panel or in the audience wants to chime in on this question, or should we move to the next one, which is more about forward looking around building coalitions or continuing to build coalitions?
And also just wanted to point out there's some questions in the chat if any of the panelists would like to respond to those.
Shoshana, do you think you could read the questions? Maybe that would help.
Sure, I'm sorry. Okay, so there was one question. What connections do you see between the issues mentioned in the agricultural sector and issues in social insurance generally? Things like the lack of recognition of unpaid caregiving, the role played by existing safety net programs and social insurance as a tool to reduce racial wealth inequality, which is a big question. So.
I think it is a question that really does kind of sum up what we're all what we're all pursuing in our ways, and how do we bring all of our, you know, our insights and work together. And you know, I think I do hope that folks will check out some of the Rural Coalition's most recent response to the pandemic response, and also on this specifically on the BIPOC letter for providing relief to people of color farmers. Are you, Shoshana, are you going to read the second question as well?
Oh, yep. Is Teresa or Sarah or Florence or Mr. Zipper, before we move on, does anybody want to?
Yeah, I mean, I'm trying to capture a couple thoughts that I'm having. And I think one of the things that often comes up for me is sort of where citizenship fits into all of this, and how, especially, in this moment when we're looking at the challenges that farm workers are facing as essential workers who often, cannot work remotely from home, and are, facing a number of sort of disproportionate health impacts from the pandemic. I think it's interesting to think about, where do federal policies fail undocumented workers, and is there space within those policies to sort of shift enough to actually protect workers in that position? Looking at France and the proposal, the sort of work that they're doing to recognize the contributions of essential frontline workers who are immigrants with citizenship status. Like, that's a really interesting idea. I don't see that going very far in the United States. But I do think that, looking, as Annie Laurie indicated, sort of at the question of citizenship in this way is a really important one for us to consider, given that, so many workers within this industry are not protected by virtue of their citizenship.
And I think, Trina, I've been trying to really wrestle with your question. And some of the questions too that we've been wrestling in our work is some of the issues connected to social safety net, in particular the way that other Western industrialized countries would think of it, such like France or Germany, that have very strong support systems in place, and the extent to which in the US we have some, I don't want to say if it's political and appetite, but it doesn't seem that while political opinion polls show that people are in favor of universal insurance or are in favor of universal Medicare, the extent to which politicians haven't been willing seemingly to pass those important, policy reforms, and, let alone issues connected to citizenship. And so I think too, it's a question that I have for this group is, what leverage can we pull on towards measure policy reforms connected to childcare, health insurance, but I think also retirement and the inadequate retirement from Social Security that many people have to rely on.
Marianne also put a question in the chat, but I'm wondering, maybe Sarah also, and Mr. Zippert, if you wanted to respond to that, are there back-end financial vehicles to repay farmers when their products are exported or sold so they profit? Are there models for community farms like Israel Kibbutz that can improve the support of the ag sector? It seems some of these issues that Marianne's also bringing up kind of touch into concentration consolidation issues and power, but I defer to you about this.
I just want to comment briefly on this and say that most of my life I worked for something called the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. And at least for us, cooperatives were a way to mobilize small producers collectively and cooperatively to market, and in some cases to add value to the products and benefit more in the end. So I would say that cooperatives offer a way for farmers and other rural people to make an economic difference, and they are democratically run and controlled and owned when they're done properly. So I think that's one thing, at least as the Federation of Southern Cooperatives has helped people to hold on to their land. We have also encouraged them to organize cooperatives and credit unions as a way to further hold on to the resource that was flowing through their hands.
Thank you for those questions. I'm going to move to the last, it's actually a group of questions for last 4 or 5 minutes together. It's a group of questions that are all connected, and I'd be curious to hear what folks have to say, both on the panel and in the audience. So the question goes, where do you see opportunities to build coalitions or momentum within the food system and outside the food system to work towards greater economic security? What opportunities are there to bring a variety of groups already doing this work together? How can trust be built and protected when groups with competing interests come together?
I'll just make a comment. I noticed yesterday, Tom Vilsack, the returned Secretary of Agriculture, who was under Obama and then now Biden also appointed, he was addressing the National Farmers Union Convention, and when the question of fair prices for farmers and through supply management mechanism, so that would be a way that farm production could actually be more closely in relation to actual demand, so that you didn't get this overproduction of glutting of the market that leads to the low prices, which is actually a policy mechanism that has been used in the United States, is used in some commodities, is used in other parts of the world. Vilsack immediately raised the specter of, well, if it's going to raise consumer prices, then you can't even talk about it. And I think that that is a really common thing, to try to pit the farmers and the consumers against each other when there's more than enough money in the marketplace. If you worked out a system and a values-based supply chain that didn't allow for like the concentrated processing, distribution, and retail sector to take more than their fair share of what consumers are paying. So I see that as a really great opportunity, and we see a lot of people really cluing in to how that system is working or not working. And so I see a lot of opportunity, and I don't want to be pushed by the powers that be to try to run to my farmer corner because I need to be in opposition to consumers, because that is a false choice. And we'd be better off uniting the farmer interests and the consumer interests for good, affordable, accessible, appropriate, healthy food.
So Sarah, the connection between the consumer and the farmer is an important one, right? And I think historically that's been one in particular in the farm, you know, the 1980s crisis, where eaters came out, I think in some ways, and supported farmers. But here's a question that was asked to me on Saturday when I presented the work on health insurance, and said, in the current, it was a fascinating question, and it's a hard one to respond to. You know, thinking about the last 5 to 6 years and the political shifts that we have seen, and how in the previous administration, how farmers were seen were a group that was convoyed by by the former president, and the extent to which there is a lot of animosity in the US, and there's a lot of divisions between folks who voted one way over another way. And his question was, to what extent can we see eaters coming to support the farm sector when there might be a vision, in particular consumers who are in urban areas, a vision of farmers voting against their own interest and the interest of the rest of the population? So that was one that, you know, I think is like, how do we respond to that? But I think, what is the reality of also of what happened in the last 4 years for our ability to come together over certain issues?
Yeah, I mean, those are super important things. As a person, you know, living in a rural space and being in a farm community, I always like to remind my urban and coastal friends that the farmers, rural people are not a monolith. And so, yes, of course, there may have been that voting pattern, which has been ascribed to the farm population. But, you know, they're also, when we look at counties, they like that we often talk about voting patterns in county blocks if we go down from states. And, you know, if my state voted 49% to 51%, it gets coded a certain color, but that's probably a purple color if you were really truthful about what was going on. So, but certainly as far as like building unity, if there are perceptions that somehow, you know, certain voting blocks ushered in the other side, I actually think that food is a very unifying thing. And if there's anything that we could get together around, it would actually be food. And so, you know, seeking to maybe think about the goodness and the healthiness of the things that we can produce and that we can be in relationship with people in urban spaces across the urban rural continuum, or whether it's people that, you know, are farming or not farming. That's where the opportunity is. It's not easy. I mean, it's just going to take a lot of hard, patient, relational work. But clearly we need to do that rebuilding, and why not, you know, do it with over food, because we all need it and it can be pretty tasty.
Yeah, I think this is really important. I'll just emphasize the building trust. I mean, building trust is often by like actually getting together and working on these things and making sure that everyone's voices are heard. So I think this is it's a great way to start, is to think about like who's not at the table. And really just, you know, with the work that we do, you know, we are really emphasizing building those relationships with the, you know, with the folks who represent us, and also bringing everyone to the table.
So I was just really curious to hear, you know, Teresa, your thoughts on this, because you work in this really interesting space with migrant, you know, with dairy workers, right? And then we have the whole dairy industry that's been on this verge of collapse, you know, and so what are your thoughts?
Yeah. Oh man, a lot of them. I think that, you know, to return to thinking a little bit about those programs that are built on worker-driven social responsibility, I think that that's a really interesting entry point into improving both working conditions for farm workers and, you know, increasing the sort of the justness of their workplace, but also getting money out of the area of the food system where there is concentration, which is largely large scale buyers, right? And so thinking about how can some of the money, for example, looking at the Milk with Dignity program that Unilever holds, be actually transferred to farm owners to improve the working and living conditions of the employees on their farms. So, you know, I think here in Vermont, we're yet to see a really strong, widespread sort of opportunity for alliance building between farm owners and farm workers, but I'm hopeful that those kinds of programs that recognize the difficulties that farmers face and don't ask for money to be squeezed out of places that it just doesn't exist. But I do think that, you know, those kinds of programs built upon, again, the Fair Food Program offer some really interesting opportunities for building some of those connections and not, you know, getting the money where it actually is concentrated. Yeah, and Hillary, I think that point is really an important point to the transition of farm workers to farming. Within the dairy industry, that's a very different question than we look at, you know, small scale diversified farming, just looking at the capital that it requires to start a dairy farm. But yeah, absolutely, I think that's a really important piece as well.
So I want to be mindful of time, Griffin. It's 2:25. Are we running out of your out of your time box.
Yeah, if you all have, I mean, if you have hard stops, I want to be respectful of your time, but if you want to keep talking or if there are any questions you have outstanding, feel free to give some quick answers. We could go another 5 minutes or so. Totally up to you, Florence.
And I leave it open to everybody else too.
Maybe if people have closing remarks or something that they want to share before we wrap up.
I just have one issue that I've been struggling a little bit, like as we're trying to talk about reform and in the agricultural sector and thinking about social insurance and especially when we think about the small and medium farms that are really oftentimes more at the edge. And we want to encourage people to go into this, but really unless there's fundamental reform, what kind of livelihoods are we asking people to undertake here? And I think we're doing a lot of farmer training and we talk a lot about economic development through food and agriculture, but until we really wrestle with the quality of those jobs, you know, it just worries me about what we're promising can happen with this without some substantial safeguards in place. And I don't know how others are thinking about this, but I just, you know, it's it's something that bothers me.
Yeah, I would love to continue to get to know all of you and also to read, you know, some of your research. One of the things that I struggled with today in a letter that we were sending out was about whether people really understand the connection between like economic justice, if you will, and things like, you know, health disparities and, you know, and also like wealth, you know, what it means, like why, you know, multi-generational family wealth is actually a justice issue. And so it kind of goes into that same conversation, Shoshana.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I've been really excited about, sort of looking at the possibility of alliance building are the conversations around sort of decolonization of food systems happening alongside the conversations around Black Lives Matter and how that sort of connects with food. On my list of books that I need to get into is this brand new edited volume that has come out recently called Black Food Matters. I think that those openings and those conversations are really exciting and I think are really ripe for all of this sort of potential for alliance building between different groups that have been really damaged by powerful entities in the food system.
I unfortunately have to go to another meeting, so I'm going to have to say goodbye, but it was really great being part of this panel with everybody, and I hope that we can continue to have conversations moving forward.
Yeah, Florence, do you have any closing remarks? Thanks so much, Shoshana.
No, I think I want, yes, I do have a closing remark, I guess. I do want to say thank you very much for coming today and for engaging into this topic. I think that it's one that we don't often get to talk about. And I think that those are also very complex problems and very different, would require a lot of different types of policy prescriptions, societal changes, changes in values. And I would say from my perspective, it's sometimes hard to feel optimistic about what the future looks like. So I do appreciate the opportunity to engage as a group in these questions. And I do hope that we continue having those conversations about what can we do from our different perspectives as activists, researchers, and everyday individuals. What can we do to move this work forward?
Yeah, that's great. Thank you all so much. As someone who's not really familiar with the agricultural policy space, I feel very fortunate to have just learned from you all about what sort of priorities we need to take from. I think one reason why I was so excited to have this conversation is that there's all these people in the income policy section or sector, and then there are people like you all who either work on income security for farmers or are a farmer in Sarah's case or work with farmers. But those two worlds are sort of siloed, and I think we have a lot of the same goals. So I'm just really grateful for you all for coming, and for our participants and for you all, we'll send a follow-up survey just so you can tell us how we did, how it might have been more informative, or just the degree to which you all enjoyed essentially. But thank you all so much.
Thank you, Griffin. Thanks, everyone.